But now we're going to move into the programme, and I'm going to invite up Alison Gill, who's going to talk about behaviours in the boardroom. And I'm going to go early and say that Alison's bio, if you care to look at it, contains the flex of the day, because she lists all of the things that make her eminently qualified for talking about boardroom dynamics and psychology and effective boards, and then just lobs in at the end that she's, oh, by the way, I'm also a triple Olympian. So she understands the sector, she understands the board and the boardroom, and I'd like to invite Alison up now to take us through some boardroom dynamics. Yeah. Good.
I think we should start by giving Craig a big round of applause, don't you? Thank you very much for all turning up today. What a fantastic group of people, and welcome to you, of those of you online as well. I just wanted to start really by telling you a little bit of a story. So I work a lot with boards and have done for many, many years. And the focus of my attention is always on how can I nudge this board to be more effective than it is now. And I've worked with some really ugly boards. I've worked with some fantastic boards. And I've worked with some boards that really aspire to just continuously improve. And I know that's what everybody in the room is here to think about today. So let me start by just telling you a story about a board that I've been working with recently. I'm going to call the chair Mary. Now, part of the work I do is coaching, part of the work I do is development workshops, part of the work I do is board reviews. So in this situation, I was doing a board review, and as part of the observation, I came and sat in on a couple of their board meetings. And I thought, Mary's a really inspirational character. And it was very clear from the board meeting, right from the start, that she had good respect with her board, and that they had a good sort of sense of humour, combined with a good sense of focus on what the business was. But as we went through the board meeting, I found every now and again the board would sort of descend into chaos, either getting way too dragged into the detail or just so exuberant about the topic at hand that they couldn't quite contain themselves. And it really brought home to me in that kind of moment that actually the role of the chair to facilitate the dialogue in the board meeting is one of the most critical elements of the chair's role. In the interviews that I did with other board members after the observation, one of the board directors said, Mary's a pretty unconventional chair. I said, go on, just explain a bit more about that. And he said, well, chairs come in many, many guises, and there's no doubt that Mary has very strong intentions. And she often says to us, I want you to really challenge each other. And she often says to us, we need to make a decision, but we need to make the right decision. But her inability to really galvanise the board means that we often end up making decisions outside of the room. To which some of the other board members said, I'm not sure that matters. We get to the decision. We have quite a lot of ad hoc meetings outside, and we believe we're making the right decisions. But it was a really good example, from my point of view, of how good governance really matters. You have to get the best out of the people in the room as well as outside of the room, and you need to work within the structures of what a board is there to do, which is to ensure that there is consensus and that diversity of views are taken on board. And I hope that sort of serves as kind of what I think is a really important recipe for effective boards, which is that we understand how the dynamics of a board, the behaviour of a board, and really effective governance work together in a trio. And that sometimes, as governance professionals, as reviewers, as chairs, we have to think about where's the area that we need to nudge here. Do we need to nudge in all three directions? or do we need to nudge very hard in one particular direction? Now, in the case of Mary, the big nudge was, can we persuade her that this board would be much more effective if she would learn to facilitate and get the best out of the board, so that the board could leave feeling as if they'd made the decision, come to a successful conclusion in the room, rather than always having to go outside to reiterate several times to actually get to a kind of consensus point of view. I'm glad to report that's an ongoing journey. We shall watch this space. So I'm going to talk just a little bit today about some of the tools that I use in the field of behaviour, particularly board behaviour, and board dynamics. They're practical tools that could be available to anybody in this room, should you wish to use them. Please contact me if you do, and I can point you to some other references and resources as well. And then to really sort of finish up with thinking a little bit about another example of a case study where I've had to use all three elements in very strong ways to kind of nudge the board to behave quite differently. I'm purposely going to use some examples from not just the sports world, but also from the rest of my sphere, which is around governance in the corporate sector. Partly because it's quite a small world, and if I tell too many examples from sport, you'll probably start guessing which sports I'm talking about, and that would be a disaster. But suffice to say that because I work across such a number of different sectors, what I can say is that whilst in sport you may have particular challenges around the fact that often the boards are constituted with elected directors, nominated directors and independent directors, and all those three tend to come from different perspectives. Equally, in the world of the corporation, public-private sector, there are equally as many different examples of boards and the trials and tribulations that they have in terms of coming together to be an effective group. So at the end of the day, I always say a board is a group of people, and that's the most fundamental thing, is it has a very specific job to do, and that's where governance really comes in. And I don't need to tell you that because you're all experts in the room. So being really clear on what is the role of the board is really important. And if the board isn't fulfilling its role, then we have to try and understand what other things that we can nudge, either by pushing on that governance framework or by pushing and nudging on a kind of behaviour or a board dynamics point of view. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what is board behaviour and how do I use a framework for what is board behaviour and board dynamics, so that we have a kind of collective view in the room, hopefully by the end of this talk. But just in short, I always say board behaviour can be very highly defined. It's absolutely observable. So you can describe the behaviour of individuals and the collective of a board once you have a framework by which to do that. And it's really important to focus on board behaviour because it's directly linked to outcomes. And I'll tell you what I mean by that in a minute. Board dynamics is different. Board dynamics are sensed, right? They're often the things that we think, oh, God, just doesn't quite feel right, or I feel frustrated. Or this feels great. We're really, really making progress here, and I'm really enjoying my interaction with the board. Dynamics are directly linked to the energy and the quality of decision making, and I'll explain what I mean by that. And as I said, you know much more than I do about governance. So let's start with the sort of framework that I tend to use with regarding board behaviour. I've developed this over a number of years. It's based on quite explicit research, and it's very directly linked to the job of a board. Okay, so there are 11 behaviours, there are 4 clusters. And if you think about the 4 jobs of the board has a very important role to play in strategy. Okay. The board needs to be involved in developing proposals, challenging proposals, and signing off strategy of the organisation. So there's a cluster of behaviour which is around strategic thinking. Okay. The second cluster is what I call the involving behaviours. And those are behaviours about really making sure that the board is getting the best out of every single person in the room, so that it's an inclusive board, that it leverages the diversity in the room, and that the chair is facilitating, and that each director is listening deeply to each other, because that's what creates trust and respect. And that there's a sense of education within the room in terms of developing collective capability, but also non-execs supporting the execs in their role. Right? And that's what the board is there to do. It's there to make sure that the executives feel supported, and that they are developing, and that we're getting the best out of the collective. The third cluster is around inspiring stakeholder confidence. Boards are not there to deliver to one set of stakeholders. They are there to ensure that all their stakeholders are engaged with, understood, and are communicated with regularly. And the board has a massive role, not just the chief exec or the executive team, but the board has a really important role, because every time you step into an environment of your members, your top athletes, your representatives around the country, they want to know, if you're on the board, they want to know that you really know what they think, and they want to know that you really understand what's going on the board, and they're interested in that, so they take cues from you as board directors. And then finally, the board has a role in terms of performance oversight. It must delegate authority appropriately, and it must make sure that it's a clear set of performance measurements. So obviously this is a really short summary of the behaviours that I use, but hopefully you can see how behaviour is directly linked to outcomes. Fundamentally, if board directors are empathetic, then the trust between those directors is much stronger. Make sense? If I feel listened to and heard, the chances are I'm going to trust you much more. If the chair facilitates well, the board will come to good consensus decisions. If there's a strong focus on really good questioning, seeking information, then that dynamic, which is so important in a board, will work. Okay? So board behaviour is directly linked to the fundamental jobs of the board, and getting that sense of connectivity of why behaviour really matters can be so helpful in terms of helping a board to think differently about its performance. Now, obviously, there's a sort of description of each of these behaviours in much more detail, but I'm not going to go into that here. Hopefully, just give you a kind of concept of what it's like. And just to give you a sort of example of how that can work, if I'm working with a really effective board, there are certain things that I really expect to see. I have a very live example of this at the moment. I'm working with a big PLC board. It's one of the best boards I've worked with for a long time. And what you experience when you go into the room with these board directors is that there is a strong sense of individual responsibility from each director. It's very clear that those directors have read the board papers. It's very clear. The quality of the board papers is great. Very clear what the ask is of the non-execs. Succinct, not 800 pages, which many board packs are. And the chair is leading in a facilitative way. And most importantly, there's a sense of humility. So not a sense that it's an ego, a place for egos, but rather a place where the board's job is to actively question, to test understanding, to question strategically, and to explore what's being put in front of them in a helpful and constructive way. So just by way of example of how some of these behaviours work, I think when you observe really good questioning, I think what you observe is a number of different things. So you observe broad questions, which are really designed to explore, help me understand why you have come up with that proposal. You see focus questions, which are around, I'm not quite clear what your objective is. Can you tell me who's accountable for this piece of work? Exactly when do you think it's going to be delivered? You observe closed questions. My favourite closed question of all time, which I stole from an American non-exec, in a very big bank who used to ask this question and became infamous for it, is have you got the right resources to deliver what you're proposing? Now just think about that question. As an executive, that's a really hard question to say yes to, isn't it? But if you say no, then why is that not in your plan? Why aren't you bringing that to the attention of the board as being a challenge and an issue? So the fact that this director has a reputation for asking this question means that the execs never go into the boardroom without being clear about what their answer is to that question. Try it sometime. I think you'll find it's a helpful one. But questions also have to be empathetic, because there's a relational component in a board, and trust fundamentally, like any group of people, any team, needs to be very deeply ingrained for a board to be successful. So empathy is about, do I really understand what you think and feel? Do I really understand what issues and challenges you face? Can I create an environment where, regardless of whether you want to come in and say what you're really worried about, that you will? Can I create an environment where the chief exec and the chief financial officer will actually disagree in the boardroom? Or any other of the management team can come in and fundamentally say what's really on their mind. I had a lovely example of this week, where a situation where the chief exec was looking to hire a new CFO. CFO was timing out, about to retire. She'd put 2 candidates on the table, and she said to the board, it's a 60-40 situation. I have got a slightly preferred candidate, but I can't really quite make my mind up. And several of the directors asked us some really good questions, but one of the directors said, tell me how you felt at the end of the second interview you had with each of those candidates. Just explain to me your feelings in that moment. I thought, what a great question. And of course, it led to her openly talking much more and working through in that kind of boardroom environment what she really felt, thought and felt, and she needed that. She clearly needed that support. Of course, it can't always be supportive, but these type of constructive questions can be very challenging and can deliver the challenge that executives really value. And I can tell you that most of the board reviews I do, when I say to the chief exec, what value do you get from the board? More often than not, they will say, I would like more challenge. I would like more challenge. And challenge isn't about being too pushy. It's not about being overly assertive or overly aggressive, but it is about coming back with those good questions that help the chief exec or whoever it is from management to think differently about the situation that they're in. And that requires a real degree of sophistication. And I always say to board directors, the one thing that you need to keep doing is honing your questioning capability. Hone your questioning capability. When you see a board that does it really well, it's quite an orchestration, and you can definitely see the value that it adds. So that's a bit about behaviour. Let me move on now to talk a little bit about board dynamics. So as I said, board dynamics are really about the energy that's in the room in board meetings, but the energy that exists between people as well. So this might look a little bit complicated, but it's not. Okay, so if you're looking at it from there, on the left-hand side, so in the green, there's a whole set of positive emotions. Right? So if I asked any of you in the room now, tell me 3 emotions that you've experienced in the last week that are positive. What would you say? Joy. Excellent. Love. Happiness. Okay. What about 3 emotions that are not quite so energizing, but are more kind of contentment? Calm. Yeah. Satisfaction. Yeah. Warmth. Good. Okay, so on the left-hand side, we've got the top quadrant, which is all about the higher energy stuff. So passion, yes, enthusiasm, engagement, challenge, dynamic, agile. Those are words that typically fall into that quadrant. In the bottom, you've got the sort of slightly lower key, calmer, collaboration, support, contentment, satisfaction. Okay. Now, in a boardroom, what we really want is to stay as much as we can on the left-hand side of the quadrant. Right? Because on the right-hand side of the quadrant are the emotions that drive things like cortisol. What does cortisol do to you? It's a stress hormone. Okay. It also puts fat on your belly. Okay. Unhealthily. Not very good for an athlete, particularly. So what we want is a boardroom that fundamentally is mostly here. And there's a very good reason for that, and that is because, chemically speaking, positive emotions keep us in an anabolic state, right? And in an anabolic state, our brain can work to its best capability. Okay? If we shift onto the right-hand side of the quadrant, okay, what happens on the bottom right is we check out. Right? So if we feel we're not heard, we check out, yeah? If we feel like no one's, we don't know the answer, it's all a bit chaotic, we don't know where to focus our attention. Okay? So we almost kind of get into that state of apathy, and an apathetic board is a useless board. Okay? State the obvious. If we get into the upper right-hand quadrant, we're in a different place altogether, because cortisol basically is a DIY lobotomy. Okay? So if you're in a board and your boardroom is frustrated, overly tense, angry, you can basically disregard any decision that's been taken in that moment. Okay? You can disregard any decision that's been taken in that moment because your brain is in flight mode or fright mode. It's not in smart thinking mode. Okay? So I think this is really important science. It's not my science. If you wanted to look it up, Dr. Alan Watkins, fantastic videos on YouTube about this stuff. I use this when I work with boards. And what I do is a really simple practice which anybody can do. So I say to the board, if you were going to describe the culture and dynamics of the last 2 board meetings, what 3 words would you use? Okay. And then I plot them on my axis. And it's always a really fascinating picture because it gives me a very clear sense of how energised is this board, or whether actually there are things going on that we really need to look into. Because most board directors can tell you very quickly what their 3 words are. Occasionally the CFO struggles because he likes to work in numbers, she likes to work in numbers. But usually if you give them enough time, they'll come up with an answer. Okay? So this is a real example of a board that I worked with recently, actually in the sports sector. Okay, so it immediately gives you some cues that we've got some work to do. Right. Some of the board are finding it frustrating, anxious being there. And some of the things that, you know, once you look into that, some of those things are about, particularly in the sports world, elected directors not feeling comfortable that they can really talk about anything except for their sport. So they'll contribute when the topic turns to the sport, but aside from that, they don't feel comfortable and confident to participate. And there's a really easy piece of work you can do around those questions to help them start to get confidence that they don't necessarily need really in-depth knowledge about all the topics that they're worried they don't know enough about, but they do need to be able to ask really good questions. And really good questions deliver really good answers. And actually, that's what your management team want. So that's just some of the things that you can do in terms of intervention. It gives you a really clear focus to kind of ask, well, what makes you feel anxious? Why are you finding the board is an anxious place to be? What makes you think the board is getting into too much detail? What is that causes that to happen, and what could we do? So is it a behavioural thing, or is it a governance thing that we need to change? Papers that are rubbish drive the board into really overly detailed conversations. If the ask of the board isn't really clear, that drives the board into chaotic, overly detailed conversations. Inexperience of non-execs drives the board into conversations that are not at the right level about the right things. So you've got to be a bit of a detective to try and pinpoint what are the things that would really make a difference. So now we're starting to see how governance, board dynamics and board behaviour have to work together. And just to finish off, I'm just going to describe, not from the sports world, but from a very different place, but hopefully it's a useful example of how we had to work on all three angles to get this board to change. So this board this company was owned by 100% by its shareholder. And so what happens in that situation is the shareholder usually wants to have quite a number of people on the board from their business because they want to know what's going on. Okay? And the shareholder is usually very convinced that what the business needs to do is to make enough profit that they get their dividends. Okay? And that becomes their sole focus of attention. And often the directors that are on the board are incentivised for that to happen. But that might not be the right thing for the business. And the board's job is to ensure that the long-term success of the survivability of the organisation is front of mind. So in this situation, the CEO, very successful, 20 years, been growing this business, been bought in the last 5 years by the shareholder, fantastic, very happy he is, got a fantastic team around him, but the business has just bought a couple of very large organisations and is about to really go global on a big sale. And he's a bit tired because he's been around for 20 years building this fantastic, quite complex business. And he's also a bit fed up of the shareholder because they keep trying to drive the profits into their own organisation. And so what we worked out was that we needed a very clever focus on shifting the dialogue, behaviour, to this CEO wants to retire. And so, but the shareholder doesn't want the CEO to retire because he's been very successful and he's not that old. Okay, so we can't just say that. We can't just go in there and say that. But what we can say is good corporate governance tells us that the board and the nomination committee should be having regular conversations about what the company needs in terms of the CEO. Now, this company's changing so dramatically. Let's have that open discussion without the CEO in the room, obviously, about if we started with a blank sheet of paper, what would we need? What would we get? Okay? Succession is often a thing that's done quite badly because people don't want people to go because if they've done well, they're loyal to them and they don't want them to move on. But companies often need different leaders. So my job was to work with the independent directors on this board to work out the language that we could use and the COSEC to present very clearly that the board needed to do this because it was part of the governance code that they subscribed to. So we've got governance, working with the independent non-exec directors, talking about behaviour. How do we present this in a way which is acceptable? And then we had a very clear conversation about dynamics. So how do we have this conversation in a way which will lead us to the right conclusion for the business? How do we have this conversation? What do we want the conversation to be like? What information do we need? How can we make it an open conversation? And I'm glad to say that the board is now on quite a different trajectory and there will be a new CEO coming on board soon. But it was a very tricky situation and I was absolutely clear that the nudge would only work if it worked on all three angles together. If we left any one of those uncovered, we were either going to have a difficult conversation that didn't go anywhere, we weren't going to approach it confidently enough, and we weren't using the vehicle of governance in terms of the board's role to deliver on something for the company and for the shareholder, but for also all the other stakeholders as well. So it's a very short presentation on some of the things that I find fascinating about boards, but also hopefully some useful tips and techniques in terms of how you can think about your boards in terms of how corporate governance, board dynamics and board behaviour work together. Does anyone have any questions before?
That was fascinating. How do you persuade a board that perhaps they need some advice?
So I think it does depend a little bit on what the advice is about, okay? But I would always come back to being very straightforward about our role is to do this. And I think from my perspective, I can see it feels like actually we could do with a bit of input or some different perspectives. So that might be one approach. But I would also perhaps think quite a bit about who has the ear of the board. Because if you feel you're not the right person and don't have the ear of the board, or for whatever reason don't think it's right that you do it, then sometimes you have to find the one or two people that do have the ear or the board and influence them. And generally, particularly people who are a little bit outside of the board, maybe it might be one director on the board, it might be someone who's has the ear of the chair or the ear of something. If you can find the one or two people, the fact that you go to them to ask for help often is the catalyst for change. A few ideas. How have you done?
I resign.